and the lightning ascended into heaven, taking with it a radiant star. When the star disappeared in the sky, Alexander, too, had shut his eyes.
You better not bring Alexander into the crossroads of civilization. Maybe on the ashes, yes.
First and foremost, as most brilliant conqueror and inspiring leader of men that antiquity ever saw, possibly anyone's ever seen since.
Alexander is the son of evil.
Certainly Alexander ushers in a new age into the world, into world history, as it were.
For 2 centuries, the people of Persia had been living in peace at the secure center of the world's largest empire. But late in the year 331 BC, every available fighting man, every horseman who could be found, was called to the defense of the empire. They assembled at a place called Gaugamela. A vast army under the command of the great king Darius III, surrounded by his 10,000 immortals. They were threatened by a man who had set out to conquer the world. Alexander of Macedonia was 25. He was already master of Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, where he was made pharaoh, both king and Egyptian god. Alexander the Macedonian sought to exemplify the Greek ideals, the heroic body, epitomized by Hercules, the divine hero, the pantheon of gods, led by Zeus, who protected the city-states, among them the world's first democracies. Alexander's mind was shaped by Greek philosophy. His tutor, Aristotle, reinforced the Greek view that those who did not speak Greek were barbarians. And now Alexander pitted himself against the great symbol of barbarian might. The Persian kings of the Achaemenian dynasty. Deal with them, counseled Aristotle, as with beasts or plants. The Persian soldiers had never conquered Greece, but had once burnt the Parthenon at Athens. Unlike the Greeks, the Persians had only one god, Ahura Mazda, who was in constant combat with Ahriman, the devil. But it was the king on earth who commanded absolute allegiance, and his subjects showed their allegiance with lavish gifts. The king's gift in return was security. But Alexander was now dismantling the Persian Empire. Once the empire stretched from the Mediterranean to India. Now Alexander had swallowed the western half and was preparing for a final confrontation at Gaugamela. The style of fighting between Macedonian and Persian differed greatly, as shown on the Alexander sarcophagus in Istanbul. The small Macedonian horses were highly mobile. The Persians relied on archers to keep the enemy at a distance. But once the well-armored Macedonian infantry swept through their ranks, the Persian lack of body armor was fatal. Early chroniclers exaggerated the odds facing Alexander, but when he saw the size of Darius's army at Gaugamela, he was at first shaken. He employed a tactic of genius. he pulled the left wing of his front line back at an angle, tempting the Persian wings to follow, and they did. As more and more Persians were drawn into this battle of the wings, a gap opened in the Persian center, where Darius commanded from his chariot. Timing his thrust to the second, Alexander charged the gap, making straight for Darius himself. Alexander came within striking distance of the great king, but the Persian bodyguard fought to keep him off. Darius fled the field, leaving the way open for Alexander to conquer the rest of Asia.
That victory made Alexander the master of civilized Europe and much of Asia. Already he'd outperformed Heracles and the Greek gods against whom he measured himself. And what is more, as time passed, Alexander was to become the greatest of all the heroic legends. Look at them. As the shelves of the British Library show, Alexander is an industry for one historian after another, beginning with those who actually went on his campaigns, right up to those who, 2,300 years later, are still portraying him as the embodiment of all the greatness of the Greek world. But how was this view arrived at? How is history written? Who was Alexander really? After his death, he became larger than life and was adopted as a legend, not just by the Greeks, but by Europeans, even by some of the countries he conquered. A case, in fact, of becoming all things to all men. One way to write history is to gather it from other people's books in places like this great library. Legitimate enough. Another way is to test the accounts by searching at first hand for the evidence wherever it is. And that's what we're going to try and do, joining Alexander on the verge of his greatest prize.
After his victory at Gaugamela, Alexander plunged south, taking the great Achaemenian centers of Babylon and Susa. Near Persepolis, he faltered. The historian Robin Lane Fox explains.
Here on the road from Susa to Persepolis, a fascinating example in microcosm of the problems that Alexander had to overcome, but also the problems that archaeologists have to overcome trying to find his triumphal sites. Robin, what might be below us?
Well, we might be sitting above the site of the Persian gates, which many have tried to find. It would be that wall running along across the bottom of the valley there with the hill leading up to it. Alexander had picked part of the army through very narrow countryside to get to Persepolis by a route away from the main road, and he marched them straight into a Persian fortification, which was manned by a large army of Persians, their great last stand on the borders of their home province.
But if this were the site, what would have happened here in the engagement?
I think we can imagine Alexander coming down then through that valley with his picked best horsemen and his crucial light troops. One of the best things in his army are the archers and the bowmen and an extraordinary group called the shield bearers, many of whom would already be over the age of 60, who could act on very rough terrain and were quite murderous. Behind the wall, the Persians had mounted catapults and arrows, the great Persian weapon, the bow, and they would have let fly at him, and there seemed to be no way out, because the heights would have been manned and boulders would have been coming down, and Alexander just had to turn round, beat retreat, admit defeat, and leave a whole lot of dead bodies on the battlefield. And that, for a Greek, is the accepted sign that you've lost an engagement. I find it difficult to believe that this is necessarily the right wall, because we get the very strong impression from all the histories that Alexander faced an insuperable difficulty in getting round it. And I think that it would have been possible for him, he's said to have withdrawn 3 miles and to have divided his troops into the fittest and taken the advice of a local shepherd who could speak a language that someone in his army could understand. He trusted this man's advice and climbed up over the hills and came round into the rear. Now the trouble here is, however attractive the wall, is that if he went back 3 miles, down towards where the dam is now, he'd be back on the main road, and I think it would have been too easy for him to come round anyway. So I think we must say that we found a wall, we found fairly convincing terrain. I don't think anyone else has noted the wall before. It's a possible, and it's a near miss.
The Persian gates, wherever they are, were not more than a day's march from Persepolis, the political and spiritual heart of the Achaemenid Empire. Its center was a complex of palaces elevated on a great stone platform. The roofs were edged with gold, the stairways covered in reliefs, studded with gems and jewels. Alexander entered Persepolis on January the 31st, 330 BC. Now, to examine on the spot the events that followed, 3 historians gather at the ruins. From Harvard, Professor Richard Fry, specialist in ancient Persian history. From Persepolis, the director of the site, Dr. Shapur Shahbazi. And from Oxford, Robin Lane Fox, author of the book Alexander the Great.
Gentlemen, when Alexander first arrived here, he'd marched through Egypt and Asia Minor. He'd inflicted a great defeat on the Persians at Gaugamela. What, however, do you think were his feelings when he reached here, Robin?
I think he was aware that he was a man with a problem, because he had conquered the Persian army. He still had to catch the Persian king, but he had to decide how he was going to stand with respect to the Persians themselves. Was he just to be a conqueror? And I think that they may have had some idea of Persepolis' existence. I think he would have been surprised by the scale both of the place and its setting, of course, and above all by just the sheer quantity of treasure and objects that he found here. I think this must have made him realize that he was now a figure of world scale, if he wanted to be.
How much treasure, in your estimate, did he find here?
We only have the Greek estimates, which is 180,000 talents, which is just beyond all conception. I mean, that's thousands of times richer than the richest state in the Greek world in his century.
Shapur, what do you think his feelings were on reaching here?
Once he came here, he suddenly found out something beyond his belief. What we have to realize is that Persepolis shone with color. Every bit of the reliefs were colored. Not only that, but also the important decorative objects that were to be used on the reliefs, for example, sometimes the necklaces of the king, the armlets and everything, they were in actual metal inserted to the stone, so that you could see the king, for example, coming out of the stone as if really alive.
And what about the treasure and the booty? Do you think he, in taking that, behaved in the normal way that conquerors do?
Wherever they went, any conqueror, Persians included, went just for conquest. They seized the treasure.
But his major crime was burning Persepolis. The blaze probably started here in the Hall of 100 Columns. Ironically, the heat of the fire helped preserve the ruins by baking the stone to great hardness. Persepolis lay partly buried in ash and sediment for hundreds of years, as shown in this 17th century French engraving. Only in the 1920s, when excavations began, was the true scale of the staircases and carvings uncovered.
And you think that his motivation was what? How did it happen? Why did he do it?
Well, I don't think. I go by evidence, both archaeological and historical. Archaeology You can see it over the stones and everywhere. We have traces of fire. It was such a violent fire which destroyed everything. And it was deliberate fire because before the fire, the ornaments in the stones, which I mentioned before, had been systematically removed. Everything in the palaces have been cleared out. So it was not accidental. Now, the historians are, of course, giving elaborate accounts. The simplest and the most ancient is that by Arian, who simply says that Alexander burned Persepolis in revenge of Xerxes having burned Athens. Others make the story that a courtesan by the name of Thais induced Alexander and his army officers to kindle the fire. And Alexander repented and ordered that the fire should be extinguished, and they could not do it. Well, I think the fire, if they wanted to extinguish it, could.
Those are very strong points, very well put.
Do you agree with them?
Yes, I do, but I think that it may still be possible that Alexander was encouraged to, if you like, revert to his past, going back to the problem with which he began, by a party at which there was drinking and there was some excitement, and that he may have regretted it afterwards when his future had changed in a different way. It is possible that both accounts may be true, because within 6 months, Alexander's going to have to present himself, for better or for worse, as the new king of Persia, when he's captured Darius' body. And the burning of Persepolis is a great embarrassment.
One thing I should mention is that the nature of Persepolis made it absolutely necessary for Alexander to destroy it.
Why?
Because it was not the political capital, it was not the center that he could maintain. As long as Persepolis was alive, the Persians would not have submitted completely to Alexander. There would have always been a cradle, a center, to which the Persians would have looked.
Exactly.
I feel desperately bitter against Alexander. By the nature of my job, I have to always and every day look at Persepolis and remind that day that it was built and it was burned.
That spring, Alexander left Persepolis in pursuit once more of the Persian king. As he closed in on Darius, the Persian generals turned on their king and murdered him. Alexander continued east over the Hindu Kush, his army augmented by men from the conquered lands. He led them over a pass nearly 12,000 feet high. They suffered frostbite, snow blindness, and chronic fatigue. But Alexander was determined to be Lord of Asia. His exact route is unknown, but his campaigns are well recorded. For 2 years he zigzagged through the Hindu Kush in brilliant maneuvers, exhorting his men to continue. Many of them died. In the course of these far-reaching conquests, his army massacred tribes and butchered an Indian army. Alexander himself was severely wounded. It is said that Alexander founded cities along his route to bring civilization on the Greek model to Western Asia, but few remains have been found.
You see, wherever he had to go, he had to put some garrison, some of his men as garrison. Later, around these garrisons, villages and districts developed and they became built. The only city that we know he tried to build, was Alexandria of Egypt, of which there is no trace.
I think you've got to modify that slightly. Alexander did, as far as we can see, found purely military colonies. He also founded something, it's a very misleading term, it conjures up a vision of Tehran or London, called a city. He obviously felt there was a distinction. Alexandria in Egypt isn't actually the only city we have a tradition which is very strong in historians that he founded. I think there are many more than that.
But there are cities and people whom he destroyed. I think that the only one to be trusted is Alexandria in Egypt.
I just disagree with that. We come to the point in which we can't agree. I think that there are many more Alexandrias. I would number up to 15, possibly 18. Now, I'm not disputing for one moment that first and foremost, Alexander is a conqueror. That's why he destroyed Thebes, that's why he burnt Persepolis. That is why he placed himself against a heroic myth. One of the most important things for understanding him is what we've agreed on, that he aimed to rival Achilles, and that is not the image of a particularly creative man. But he is not a Mongol. He is not a mere wrecker, a Mongol conqueror.
Alexander, true, was a conqueror, but he had to rule. Now, in order to rule this great empire, he had to have a bureaucracy. He had to have a group of people who knew the conditions, the taxes, and how things were done. So it almost stands to reason that he would have to conciliate at least the people who ran the empire, the bureaucracy. And who ran the empire? It was mainly the Persians.
To promote integration, nearly 100 Macedonian officers were forced by Alexander to take Persian brides. He himself took 2 brides, although he had a wife.
Were his appetites in terms of passion the normal appetites of the time?
Many legends were circulated in gossip stories by Greeks. There is a reasonably strong tradition that he also had a love affair with a Persian eunuch, who remained a favorite for the last 6 or 7 years of his life, which can't be lightly set aside. On the other hand, he also married. He married for political reasons, of course. He is said, even by Arrian, his scientist historian, actually to have fallen in love with Roxane, who was an Iranian girl. She was a very political match, but he's said to have lost his head. He was having a baby by her when he died, and it turned out later to be a son. I think we could say that Alexander was ambidextrous, a man of 2 tastes.
What about, we keep hearing more and more about the banquets as it went on and so on, and the drink. I mean, was he an alcoholic?
No, you couldn't call Alexander an alcoholic. He could drink a great deal, and there's no doubt that the boozing contests at his court were of a high scale and singularly, to my mind, unattractive. I'm not absolutely certain that this is something that grew and got worse and worse as the years went by. It depends on the view one takes of a very puzzling document, Alexander's diaries in his last days, which show him for the last month of his life as being almost permanently seized over, lurching from one drinking party to the next. There is reason to suspect that this is not an altogether fair or trustworthy account of him.
Like the Greek gods and heroic men who had gone before him, Alexander was soon to pass into Western legend, but some facts at least are known. That, for example, he died on June the 10th, 323 BC, in Babylon, at the age of 32. By the Middle Ages, the Alexander romance had penetrated Christian, Muslim, and Buddhist cultures alike. Here Alexander defeats a foe. Here he visits the fountain of life, which gives immortality to those who drink its water. In Muslim countries, he was known for his talks with the 7 sages, and there are long descriptions of his visits to the Emperor of China, one country he never reached. The 2 of them together watched the sirens bathing. By the 18th century, his role as a cornerstone of European culture was confirmed.
How would we summarize the life and times of Alexander? Simply as a superb battle commander, or a man with a grand plan as well? Robin?
A man, I think, who had a feeling that Greek culture, as it stood, was in some sense superior and should be encouraged as the culture of the court of the king of Persia, which he became. And through his city foundations, he also had a view, apart from their strategic importance, that Greek culture was to establish itself, just as his tutor Aristotle had told him culture was spread through the world of the cities. And Alexander did found more than one city, and I think that is important in understanding him. But he was a man who paced himself relentlessly against the Greek heroic ideal. Persian heroic ideal is very different. It is more supernatural. It is the king wrestling with the forces of evil. Alexander's personal ideal is a struggle for achievement on the lines of the great Homeric heroes of Achilles and others. And it's that, above all, that drove him. First and foremost, a conqueror, not only a conqueror.
Chapeau.
he is of the seed of Ahriman. He is the messenger of the evil spirit sent to destroy all goodness. This is the Persian tradition. And he is the one out of three in Persian tradition who will have no atonement.
Do you think Alexander was a more creative or a more destructive force, Dick?
Well, as an individual, as a general conqueror, that's what he did. He destroyed rather than created. Now his successors, the aftermath of Alexander, is another question.
Alexander's Macedonian general Seleucus gained control of the eastern part of the empire. He was followed by a line of rulers who governed with Greek laws, lived by Greek customs, spoke the Greek language, and upheld the Hellenic ideal. In the 4th century, the city concept, the polis, was the center of the Greek world, the root of its society and culture. But its influence in the East was superficial. Today, a Western veneer has again colored Eastern cities, as here in Tehran.
I would have accepted it, as I'm wearing Western Chelsea boots. So my forefathers would have worn hoplite shield if they wanted to, or read Homer.
The lasting Greek imprint was in the art of the city. This statue, now in the Vatican, was once town goddess of Antioch, one of the Seleucid capitals. Oriental subtlety was fused with urbane classicism. But at the least, Alexander's successors had left a Greek face on the Asian culture. The cities were outposts in an oriental vastness, much of it never colonized, where the tribal nomadic life remained unchanged. The tenuous hold of the Seleucids gave way gradually to a new people who came first as nomads. They were to dominate the history of Western Asia for more than 400 years. But unlike Alexander, they had no chroniclers, and traces of them are sparse. Piece by piece, historians and archaeologists are putting together the story, an inscription, a coin, a carving. Here seems something of substance in southwest Iran. You walk up the steps, but then find an empty terrace. 10 miles away, another platform, but nothing on it, except a hint of some ancient temple. And here, remote in the Zagros Mountains, the traces of a royal road, accessible only on foot, leads to a site called Shami, and a necropolis. Here the people who resurrected the Persian Empire buried their nobles. Footprints are the derelict mark of a giant statue. On this boulder, a rare incised inscription confirms the dynasty, called the Parthians. Only about 37 sites have so far been positively identified as partly or wholly Parthian, and they are dispersed in several countries where access is often difficult. Some have yet to be excavated. Other sites are confused by multiple occupation, and a few have been found only in the last 10 years. Tangible at last, the Parthians take impressive shape in this bronze statue of a Parthian prince, now in a Tehran museum. He was accidentally dug up by the villagers in Shami, that remote royal burial ground. The Parthians came from a tribe called the Pani, who adapted from nomadism to village life, much as these tribespeople today are doing. They began to cultivate land, to put down roots, and to domesticate their animals. From the steppes they had brought the horse, an animal for work and for carrying possessions. With settled life, their horses could be stall-fed on grain instead of being raised in the open summer and winter on scratch grazing. Said a Roman chronicler of the time,
"They ride on horseback on all occasion. On horses they go to war and to feasts. On horses they discharge public and private duties. On horses they go abroad, meet together, traffic and converse."
A new breed of horse was to emerge, larger, stronger, a change which in itself was to mark the history of war.
نام خداوند جان و خرد که از این برتر اندیشه بر نگذرد ز گفتار دهقان یکی داستان به پیوندم از گفته باستان.
The Parthians also developed the stories of kings and heroes, which formed the basis of Persia's historical memory, right down to the present day. This storyteller describes the great hero Rustam, probably a figure from Parthian times. Legend says he was born by caesarean birth, that he rescued a lady's lover from a deep and burning pit. And from the white devil he went to save King Kavus. They wrestled in a dark cavern until, victorious, Rustam plucked out the devil's heart.
The king rode on his horse, and Rustam followed the king, and they rode towards Iran. Afrazib, with a huge army, was waiting on the way. Rustam said, "O king, wait a while. With the kindness of God, I shall destroy this army now." His sword was shining. From left to right, from the right side to the left side, he reached the heart of the troops. He cut the flag holder and the flag into 4 parts. He turned back. He tore up the army of Afrazib like rolls of paper. The king praised him, and they reached the soil of Iran.
Such feats were finally written down in the 10th century by the poet Firdausi in the epic Book of Kings. In it, Alexander the alien conqueror is absorbed as half Persian and even consoles the fallen Darius on the battlefield.
Allahu Akbar, Allah.
With the coming of Islam, Alexander was also made Muslim by the Persians. He shows his piety by visiting the Kaaba at Mecca. Of real kings, not mythical heroes, there is strong evidence in the coins of the Parthian period. Under Mithridates, Parthia became one of the most powerful states in Western Asia. The transition from nomad to settled people was complete. It brought with it the artifacts of empire. Only a few gold objects have so far been unearthed. Some retain the simplicity and strength of the nomad. Others reflect the sophistication of the city and the nomadic use of color. It was the city which preserved the legacy of Hellenism. These Parthian drinking cups are covered with Greek figures. A Parthian king is said to have watched plays enacted by Greeks. But in religion, the Parthians remained true to the old beliefs of the plateau, preservation of fire and respect for the elements, where good and evil had to be kept in equilibrium. They used this ancient religious site high in the Zagros mountains. Yet, in the tradition of Cyrus, the Achaemenian king, they tolerated all religions. There was stability in the empire, and the society prospered. By the time of Christ, Greece had been lost to the Republic of Rome, and Parthia stood on the crossroads between great empires. Because of her initiative, the trade routes were opened as never before. Ambassadors were sent to China. From China came new produce. For the first time, the peach and the apricot reached the west. There were spices from India. And silk, which until this time was unknown in Europe. Today, the old silk route through Iran is used by international trucks, but it no longer starts in China. Silk and spices have been replaced by the goods of a technological age. The Parthians grew rich as middlemen, exacting heavy tolls from the countries which used their land bridge. With these tolls as one provocation, the Parthian Empire aroused the attention of Rome. The Romans had the most formidable infantry of their time. They made frequent expeditions into Parthian territory. Most written accounts of the Parthians come from their enemies, the Romans. This encounter is reconstructed according to the Chronicle of Plutarch. Faced with the threat of the oncoming infantry, the Parthians resorted to psychological tactics.
For the Parthians have drums and bells, and on these they beat all at once in many quarters, and the instruments give forth a low and dismal tone.
Romans, unsure of their enemy, used their classic defensive formation, the square. Romans had never before met cavalry like this. The Parthian horse was bigger, faster, and much more mobile.
The Romans encountered a multitude of arrows which caused the beginning of disorder and fear, for they now saw the velocity and force of the arrows, which fractured armor and tore their way through every covering alike, whether hard or soft. Now, as long as the Romans had hopes that the enemy would exhaust their missiles and desist from battle or fight at close quarters, the Romans held out. For the Parthians shot as they fled, and next to the Scythians they do this most effectively. And it is a very clever thing to seek safety while still fighting, and to take away the shame of flight. But then they perceived that many camels laden with arrows were at hand, from which the Parthians, who first encircled them, took a fresh supply. Romans, being crowded into a narrow compass and falling upon one another, were shot and died no easy nor even speedy death.
The Parthians were now men of stature, as powerful as any Roman. But who were they really? Nomad, prince, bureaucrat, or feudal baron? By the 10th century AD, the great epic poet Firdusi declared,
"I have heard naught but their names, and have not seen them in the Chronicle of Kings."
Professor Lewis, when one looks, as we have, at the whole saga of the way in which Alexander was overemphasized and the Parthians were underemphasized, it raises the whole question, really, of how history comes to be written.
This raises the question of what precisely we mean by the word history. And I think some confusion arises from the fact that we use this one word, history, to mean at least 4 different things. If I may summarize them briefly, history means what happened. History means the traces or records left by what happened. Most of what happened is irretrievably lost and forgotten, but some records are left, the kind that historians call sources, chronicles, inscriptions, documents, and the like, monuments. History, in the third place, means the study of the sources or traces left by what happened. In other words, the work of the historians. It's only at this third point that the historian enters the scene. And one can add a fourth, and that is history as the sort of popular image or popular recollection, what people imagine the past to have been or what they would wish the past to have been. And this is recruited from all 3 of the first 3. And in addition, from imagination.
To what extent is the judgment of history self-serving?
Well, history makes no judgment, only historians make judgments. And every generation has to rewrite the past in order to meet its own needs and requirements, by which I don't mean that the past is simply adjusted to serve certain specific purposes, though that happens too in many societies, as we know. What I mean is that the historian puts questions to the past, and in different times and in different places, we have different questions to put. Each generation has new problems. Nowadays, we put sociological questions. Our immediate predecessors put economic questions. A couple of hundred years ago, historians thought in neither economic nor sociological terms. So that still using the same evidence, sometimes with the addition of new evidence which comes to light, as was shown, for example, on Alexander, the archaeological evidence, but basically, the change is not so much in the evidence from which we draw our answers as in the questions which we ourselves put.
And why have the apologists for Alexander over the centuries been so successful? And the apologists against the Persians as barbarians, indeed?
Well, of course, all societies known to history have divided the world into us and them. Us means the civilized, enlightened people, possessors of the true civilization or the true religion or whatever. The others are variously described as barbarians or Gentiles or aliens or wogs or various other terms of abuse which different societies have produced. The Greeks saw the Persians as barbarians, not specifically as Persians, but because they saw everybody who wasn't Greek as barbarian. We have, in a sense, inherited this, as Greece is one of the major sources of our own civilization. And we have, therefore, absorbed, shall we say, many Greek attitudes.
But we've seen that the Parthians have been somewhat ignored by history. Let's assume for a moment they're worthy of more attention than history's given them. How good is history at making a reassessment like that? Is it malleable to those sort of new judgments?
It is not only legitimate, it is necessary and natural that the historian should put questions to the past suggested by the events of his own time. What is not admissible is for him to find the answers in the past in accordance with the needs of his own time. That is the distortion of history, which in many countries is a major industry, nationalized, of course.
While this program was being made, archaeologists re-identified a site in the hills overlooking Mesopotamia. It was discovered 10 years ago and labeled as part of a later dynasty. Recent work on the hilltop fort seems now to confirm it as Parthian. It is thought to be the mountain redoubt of a nobleman of the late Parthian period, when the empire was fragmenting into isolated sub-kingdoms. Excavations have revealed important new evidence. In architecture, the Parthians transformed the vaulted arch and hall, influencing the Islamic mosque. A new kind of cement enabled these great arches to be self-supporting without columns, as here in the temple at Hatra in modern Iraq. Using the same techniques, the Parthians also developed the dome and new styles of plaster decoration. Perhaps their greatest legacy was a feudal order able to finance the heavy cavalry which dominated warfare until the introduction of gunpowder. Their prolonged rule, with its trading contacts, significantly linked the worlds of Asia and Europe, and their style of rule was to shape the future of Persia. And yet, in history, they are still submerged in the shadow of one man, Alexander.
And if you had to predict 100 years hence, would you say that we'll be thinking of him as Alexander the Great, Alexander the Accursed, or Alexander the Fairly Great?
I think Alexander the Fairly Great is the likeliest assessment. Nowadays, of course, we live in an age when the tendency is to demolish great men, recent as well as ancient. This may change, and I wouldn't like to predict the moods of the future.